The enormous silk dome, which until recently had seemed a marvel of engineering, now resembled a dead whale washed up on the endless icy shore. Niels Strindberg stood knee-deep in the snow, physically feeling the icy wind pierce his wool coat and freeze the sweat on his back. The balloon's basket banged heavily against the ice ridges, emitting a dull, rhythmic grinding that echoed across the utterly empty white plain. There was nothing around but sharp ridges of ice, merging on the horizon with the same colorless, leaden gray sky. The temperature was plummeting, turning the damp Arctic fog into tiny needles that pierced the exposed parts of their faces and burned their lungs. With every jolt of the basket, hydrogen whistled out of the balloon's envelope, carrying away the last remnants of their ambitious plan. Niels was breathing heavily, feeling the frosty air burn his throat as his feet began to lose sensation from constant contact with the snow. He tried to take a photo of the moment, but the frozen camera mechanism barely responded to his numb wooden fingers. The worst part wasn't the pain from the cold, but the silence that settled in during those brief moments when the wind died down for a second. No one heard his scream when another lurch knocked him onto the hard crust, leaving a deep scrape on his cheekbone. The team began to crack at the seams under the weight of the realization that their only means of transport had turned into a useless trap made of fabric and ropes. Salomon Andrée, their leader and ideological inspiration, was still trying to give orders, but his voice was drowned out by the howling wind. Knut Frenkel silently watched the escaping gas, and his clenched jaw showed that he was already calculating their chances. They still hoped to ride out the storm by taking shelter at the bottom of the basket, but the cold was already seeping through their layers of clothing to the very bone. This was the first day of his true ordeal, the day when illusions were finally shattered against the brutal reality of the Arctic North. The horizon was empty, and he knew it, feeling the icy void slowly filling not only the space around him, but his own soul as well. At first it seemed like a delay, just an unfortunate turn of events that could be remedied with perseverance and a scientific approach. Then it began to feel like a sentence from which there was no escape, because there wasn't a single living soul for thousands of miles around. Niels looked at the compass, whose needle trembled uselessly, giving them not the slightest clue as to where exactly they were. There was no way back, and ahead of them lay only an endless white desert that forgave no human errors. The wind picked up again, pelting their faces with stinging snow and forcing them to squint until tears welled up, which immediately froze on their eyelashes. Niels looked at Andrée, then at Frenkel, and in that wordless exchange of glances, the final verdict on their flight was clear. The basket struck the ice one last time, got stuck between two enormous boulders, and came to a standstill, ceasing its movement forever. It was the moment after which everything changed, dividing their lives into a brief past and an infinitely long, agonizing future. They didn't know it yet, but it was at that very moment that they ceased to be explorers and became survivors. A year earlier in Stockholm, the air was filled with entirely different scents, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, expensive cigars, and printing ink. Niels Strindberg, a young and brilliantly educated physicist, stood in a bright hall, listening as Salomon Andrée described his grand plan. The idea of conquering the North Pole in a hot air balloon seemed insane, but André's confidence was contagious to everyone around him. They believed that technology had advanced far enough to subdue the elements that had killed the bravest of sailors for centuries. It was an era of grand illusions, when man imagined himself the absolute master of nature, capable of flying over any obstacle. Preparations for the expedition were carried out on an incredible scale, attracting the attention of royalty, wealthy patrons, and thousands of ordinary Swedes. The Ornen balloon, sewn from the finest French silk, was a true work of art, a symbol of science's triumph over the wild, unexplored void. Niels personally handled the calculations and prepared the photographic equipment, dreaming of bringing home the first photographs of the planet's northernmost point. He was full of enthusiasm and ambition, unaware that these heavy cameras would soon become an unbearable burden for him on the ice. In those days, the horizon seemed to him not an empty threat, but a canvas on which they were to write their names. The contrast between the warm Swedish summer and the cold reality of the Arctic only began to be felt on Spitsbergen, where the expedition was set to begin. The team spent several weeks there waiting for a favorable southerly wind that would catch the balloon and carry it toward the pole. During those days, Niels often wrote letters to his fiancée, promising to return a hero and describing the beauty of the harsh northern landscapes. He still hoped the journey would be quick and relatively safe, relying on his commander's complex mathematical formulas and drawings. None of them yet understood the scale of what was happening or the monstrous error that had been embedded in their calculations from the very beginning. The launch on July 11, 1897 was marked by great ceremony, though a vague premonition of disaster already hung in the air. As soon as the balloon lifted off the ground, the heavy guide ropes unexpectedly snapped due to a technical error, robbing the Ornen of its maneuverability. Andrée, Strindberg, and Frankel found themselves in the basket of an uncontrollable balloon, rapidly gaining altitude and losing precious ballast. At that moment, they did not yet realize that they were alone, cut off from the rest of the world and unable to return. They looked at each other and saw the fear they quickly hid behind masks of professionalism and scientific focus. The balloon was carried northward into a foggy unknown, where there were no landmarks, no rescue stations, and no room for error. Niels photographed the receding coast of Spitsbergen, trying to memorize every detail, as if sensing that he was seeing land for the last time. They were still operating as a crew, clearly performing their duties, checking instruments, and making entries in the logbooks. But each of them already understood the situation was worsening with every mile that carried them further away from safe latitudes. This was not the end. It was the beginning of a real ordeal, to which their academic knowledge proved completely inapplicable. The air temperature was dropping rapidly, and the damp fog began to settle on the balloon's silk envelope as a thin, heavy crust of ice. The hydrogen providing lift was slowly but surely seeping through the fabric, causing the balloon to gradually lose altitude. Niels felt the cold seeping under his coat, causing his muscles to reflexively tense in an attempt to conserve what little heat remained. Hope existed at the start of the flight, fueled by adrenaline and faith in the genius of the human mind, which had dared to challenge nature itself. Then doubt set in when fog obscured the sun and the compass ceased to show the exact direction, plunging them into disorientation. Then came fear, cold and clammy, when they heard the first dull thud of the basket against the top of a tall ice torus. They still believed it was temporary, that the balloon would regain altitude and fly across this endless, frozen sea. But physics was relentless, and the icy silk pulled them down with a force they could no longer resist. After 2 days of an agonizing, jerky flight over the ice fields, the balloon finally gave way under the weight of the ice that had frozen onto it. The Ornen crashed onto the ice ridges, subjecting the 3 men to a brutal impact that knocked the wind out of their lungs and overturned the basket. That was the very turning point when the expedition to the pole officially ended, giving way to a desperate struggle for survival. Niels lay in the snow, trying to catch his breath, and listened as the wind tore at the remnants of the silk canopy above his head. From that day on, the expedition was over, and a struggle for survival began, one for which none of them was physically prepared. The basket lay on its side, half buried in snow, amid the chaos of tangled ropes and ballast jettisoned in the final moments. Niels slowly got to his feet, brushing icy flakes from his clothes, and for the first time consciously looked around, assessing their new prison. Endless fields of drifting ice stretched in every direction, rising in sharp ridges that resembled the spines of frozen, prehistoric monsters. The sky merged with the ice into a single gray expanse, devoid of shadows, perspective, and any signs of life for hundreds of miles. On this day, the countdown to their present time began, where hours and minutes were replaced by a struggle for every next breath. Salomon August wiped the blood from his battered face. His usual self-assurance had cracked deeply under the blow of reality. Frankel silently examined his injured knee, realizing that under these conditions, any injury could be a death sentence for the entire group. They began clearing the debris inside the gondola, trying to salvage the provisions, weapons, and sleeping bags, which were now worth more than gold. Niels pulled out his cameras, realizing that his main task was to document this disaster, even if no one ever found the film. At first, no one wanted to say it out loud, but deep down, everyone already realized that they were stuck here forever. The decision was made quickly because staying at the crash site meant certain death from hypothermia and slow starvation. Andrée announced that they must assemble the sleds, load them with the most essential equipment, and walk to Franz Josef Land. It was a march of desperation, a plan born of hopelessness and fueled only by a blind desire to keep moving so as not to freeze to death where they stood. The first day of their journey revealed the utter futility of their plan, for the ice was not flat. It consisted of deep cracks and ice ridges. They had to literally drag the heavy boats over the ice walls, risking every second that they might fall into the black, deadly cold water. Niels was breathing heavily, his lungs burned from the freezing air, and his shoulders were rubbed raw by the rough straps of the harness. He did not yet know how many days he would have to spend at this pace, where every meter of the journey demanded superhuman effort. Their most dangerous enemy was not the storm, but exhaustion, which slowly but surely drained the last drops of vitality from them. They often fell, stumbling over unevenness hidden beneath the snow, and every fall sent a sharp pain through their weary muscles. Getting back up became increasingly difficult, and sometimes Niels caught himself thinking that it would be so easy to just stay lying there. But his survival instinct forced him to get up again, harness himself to the sled, and drag them onward without lifting his eyes from the empty horizon. Captain Andrée was still keeping his composure, but not for long, as his route calculations were constantly being thwarted by the unpredictable drift of the ice. They were heading south, but the ice beneath their feet was drifting north, nullifying all their agonizing, exhausting work. In the morning, they stood at the edge of a fresh ice channel, looking at the spot where, just yesterday, their relatively safe anchorage had been. Niels took out his camera and snapped a photo of this fissure, capturing on film the fragility of their existence in this dead world. He realized that the greatest danger was not the cold, but the despair that had begun to take root in his mind after that terrible night. They still acted as a crew, but thought like the doomed, realizing that salvation was becoming more and more of a mirage with each passing day. Nature wasn't trying to kill them on purpose. It simply made no distinction between them and the chunks of frozen water. August brought with it thick, impenetrable fogs that turned their world into an endless, damp, gray room without walls. Niels' clothes had long since become saturated with sweat and seawater. They froze in the wind, turning into a stiff shell that chafed his skin. Their shoes fell apart as they walked, and they had to wrap their feet in scraps of spare cloth to protect themselves from frostbite. Their food supply was dwindling relentlessly, and hunger became their constant, obsessive companion, causing painful cramps in their stomachs. They hunted polar bears and seals, which they occasionally encountered on ice floes, but luck was far from always on their side. They often ate the meat raw or half-raw, as they had to conserve fuel for the stove with maniacal, frightening frugality. Niels felt exhaustion sucking the last of his muscle mass away, making his arms weak and trembling at the slightest effort. They began to conserve words just as they did food, because breathing in the cold took away too many precious calories. Disease had become their new invisible enemy, one that began to destroy their bodies from within, robbing them of their last hopes of salvation. Undercooked bear meat had brought with it parasites that caused excruciating stomach pains, diarrhea, and rapid dehydration. They were wasting away before our eyes. Their faces grew gaunt, their eyes sunken, and their skin took on an ashen, unhealthy hue of deadly exhaustion. Niels often stopped, leaning on the sled to cope with bouts of dizziness when the white ice began to spin before his eyes. He kept going because stopping meant dying right there, in front of his companions, who were indifferent to his pain. Hallucinations began to visit them more and more often, blurring the already fragile line between cruel reality and fevered delirium. Niels thought he heard Anna's voice calling to him through the howling wind, and he turned, hoping to see her silhouette. But behind him were only empty, lifeless ice hummocks and the hunched figures of Andrée and Frankel, trudging heavily in his footsteps. The disappointment following such visions was physically painful. It broke his will more than the harshest Arctic frost. He began to speak aloud, simply to hear a human voice and to convince himself that he still existed in this nothingness. The surroundings had a depressing effect on the psyche, as the monotony of the white landscape deprived their minds of any points of reference, causing them to lose track of time. The days merged into one long, endless agony consisting of dragging sleds, cold nights, and a constant gnawing hunger. They looked at one another and saw the fear they could no longer hide behind the remnants of their former pride and scientific optimism. The team began to split into factions inside a single small tent, where everyone tried to save every scrap of warmth for themselves. The most terrifying thing was not the pain in their freezing limbs, but the silence of their own thoughts, filled with dark, viscous despair. One day, Andrée announced that the ice drift had carried them far from their goal, and their entire journey so far had been in vain. They had been dragging heavy sleds southward, but the ocean current was carrying the ice field northwest at twice the speed. This realization was a crushing blow, after which they dropped their hands and sat silently in the snow, unable to move. Niels looked at his palms, rubbed raw and bleeding, and realized that nature was simply mocking their pitiful efforts to survive. Everything was decided right here and now, since they would never reach the warehouses, and their fate lay entirely in the hands of the blind currents. They changed course, deciding to head for White Island, which seemed to be the only reachable patch of solid ground in this chaos. But the ice was growing thinner and more cracked, turning the crossing of the wide-open water into a deadly daily lottery. Their bodies were slowly breaking down, turning into living skeletons covered in frost-bitten, cracked skin, oozing blood. Scurvy was beginning to loosen their teeth. Their gums bled, making every bite of the tough, undercooked food a true torture. Niels wrote in his diary less and less often. His handwriting had turned into the illegible scrawl of a man whose mind was clouded by pain and cold. He no longer counted the days, he counted the chances, which grew fewer and fewer with every new sunrise. Nature was in no hurry to kill him. It was simply waiting for exhaustion to do all the dirtiest and hardest work for it. In late September, after more than 2 months of agonizing marching, they finally saw a dark strip of land on the horizon. It was Balloon Island, a bare, inhospitable patch of rock and ice that seemed to them the most beautiful place on Earth. They discarded some of their gear, mustering their last shreds of energy to cover the remaining kilometers of drifting, cracking ice. Niels could see almost nothing because of snow blindness. He simply stumbled along behind Andrée's silhouette, leaning on the empty sled. September brought with it a sharp, merciless drop in temperature, turning the drifting ice into a solid, ringing monolith. Niels could barely move his legs, wrapped in tattered pieces of canvas that had long since ceased to retain even a shred of warmth. Every step on the uneven surface sent a sharp pain through his joints, worn down by the constant strain of dragging the heavy sled. They were heading south, guided by the compass, blindly believing that every kilometer they covered brought them closer to the life-saving supply depots. He still hoped that this unbearable labor would bear fruit, allowing them to escape the icy embrace of death. However, Andrée, who conducted regular astronomical observations, began to notice a frightening discrepancy in their daily coordinates on the map. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, and only rare clearings allowed him to take accurate measurements with a sextant. At first, he hid the results of these calculations from his companions, not wanting to rob them of their last, fragile motivation to keep moving. But the truth was too terrifying to keep secret for long in that cramped, sweat-soaked tent. They were divided not only by the icy desert, but also by the doubt that could be read in every glance from their weary leader. One evening, Andrée told them in a hollow, emotionless voice what finally broke their already exhausted spirit. They exerted superhuman efforts, dragging the sled southward, but the ocean current relentlessly carried them back north. This realization was the most devastating blow, turning all their previous struggle into a senseless, cruel mockery of nature. Their most dangerous enemy was not the storm, but this invisible current, which nullified every drop of their sweat. Niels listened to this verdict in complete silence, unable to muster even anger or despair. His hands fell limply onto the icy fabric of his sleeping bag, and his gaze fixed on the empty, soot-stained wall of the tent. Everything changed in a single second when they realized they were on a giant, icy treadmill working against them. A desperate decision was made to change course and head east, toward Belly Island, which was closer according to their coordinates. But this new route ran through areas of active ice compression, where the ice ridges were even higher and the cracks wider. Rations had been cut to the absolute minimum, necessary only to keep a faint heartbeat in their chests. Polar bears began to appear less and less frequently, leaving them without a source of fresh meat, vital for survival. Niels began to notice blood on his gums, the first sign of impending scurvy, which promised to turn their lives into a living hell. He looked at Frankel, whose knee had swollen to an unnatural size, and realized that every step was torture for him. Someone had already figured out who would be the weak link, but they continued to pull the sled together, gritting their teeth against the pain. The clothes they hadn't taken off in months were teeming with lice, adding unbearable itching to the endless list of their daily agonizing sufferings. They had stopped talking during the treks, conserving their breath and concentrating solely on putting one foot in front of the other. The silence between them grew heavier than the wind, filled only with ragged breathing and the dulled thud of the sled runners against the ice. From that day on, the expedition was finally over, giving way to an animal instinct that drove them forward against all logic. The world continued on its own, but for them, the universe had shrunk to the size of the next icy ridge ahead. Hallucinations became their constant companions, bringing false images of ships and campfire smoke against a completely empty horizon. Niels often stopped, rubbing his eyes, hoping that the black dot in the distance would turn out to be a rescue vessel rather than an iceberg. But hope does not change reality, and the horizon remained empty, mocking their fevered, exhausted minds. He began to speak aloud, whispering words of comfort to Anna, simply so as not to forget the sound of human speech in this silence. That was the moment when they stopped pulling the load consciously, moving solely on the autopilot of their dying consciousness. Once their ice floe split right beneath the sled, nearly dragging all their remaining priceless provisions to the bottom. They pulled the load from the black water with their last ounce of strength, tearing their fingernails and risking falling into the icy abyss themselves. Niels's clothes were soaked, and in the freezing cold, they instantly turned into an icy shell, encasing his trembling body. He realized that the greatest danger was not the cold, but this constant, unpredictable threat emanating from the very surface of the ocean. On that day, the countdown began on their last reserves, which were rapidly melting away along with their fading hope of rescue. In late September, with the polar night already breathing down their necks, they finally saw a dark strip ahead. It was neither a hallucination nor an optical illusion. It was the shore of Belly Island, covered by an eternal glacier. They stood at the edge of the ice floe, gazing at this harsh land, and tears rolled down their weather-beaten cheeks. A long journey lay ahead of them, and not all would make it to the end. But for now, they rejoiced at this patch of rock. This was not the end. It was the beginning of their final, most terrifying ordeal on this inhospitable land. The solid ground beneath their feet brought no relief. It merely changed the setting of their agonizing, inevitable end. White Island greeted them with a biting wind and a complete lack of any shelter, save for shallow crevices between the frozen rocks. They tried to build a hut out of stones, a fin, and scraps of sailcloth, working slowly, like living corpses who had lost their will. Niels felt his body finally giving out. His fever had risen, and every breath was met with a sharp pain in his inflamed lungs. At that moment, he did not yet realize that he was left alone with the fact that they would never leave this island. Illness finally knocked Niels off his feet. He could no longer get up to help his companions in their search for food and fuel. He lay in his sleeping bag inside the stone hut, listening to the howling wind and the heavy breathing of Frankel, who was also getting worse. Salomon Andrée continued to care for them. His leadership qualities flared up one last time in the face of utter hopelessness. But even he did not have enough strength to feed 3 sick people on an island that was already preparing for a long winter hibernation. Niels began to realize that help would not come, and this thought brought with it a strange, frightening sense of absolute calm. He took Anna's letters from his breast pocket, where he had kept them close to his heart, and tried to reread them by the dim light of the fire. The letters blurred before his eyes, but he knew every word by heart, recalling her voice, her laughter, her warmth in distant Stockholm. These memories were his last refuge, a place where he could escape the piercing cold and the smell of rotting bear meat. One day in October, the silence in the hut became absolute when Niels realized he could no longer hear Knut Frenkel's moans. Andrée sat next to his comrade's body, his face hidden in his hands, his shoulders shaking, but no sound of weeping could be heard. It was an emotional breaking point, the moment when the last thread holding their sanity together snapped with a dull, painful sound. They were separated not only by the icy desert, but also by death, which had entered their hut and taken the first of them. No one wanted to take responsibility for the funeral because they simply didn't have the strength to dig the ground, frozen hard as stone. Niels closed his eyes, feeling the pain fade, giving way to a strange, enveloping numbness that brought long-awaited peace. He imagined the Ornen balloon flying high above the clouds, free from ice and gravity, heading straight for the sun. At that moment, he did not yet realize that he was alone, as Andrée had likely already stopped breathing beside him. Everything changed in a single second when the pain vanished, the cold receded, and only the endless, soothing whiteness of the Arctic sky remained. No one had prepared him for the loneliness of death, but now it didn't matter, because all his fears were behind him. The Arctic took its time, gently wrapping their bodies in a snowy shroud, hiding the traces of their agonizing struggle for life. White Island was plunged into the polar night, and only the howling wind served as a requiem for the three explorers who remained here forever. Their camp was buried in snow, turning into an inconspicuous mound among thousands of similar mounds in the boundless expanses of the Arctic. Nature was in no hurry to kill them. It simply waited, and now its wait had come to an end, swallowing them whole. History had already begun to unfold in a new light, as a mystery that would torment the world for many decades to come. From that moment on, time had finally stopped for them, while the rest of the world continued to live, love, and make discoveries. Niels Strindberg, Salomon Andrée, and Knut Frenkel became ghosts of the North, dissolving into the white silence they had so desperately sought to conquer. None of them yet understood the magnitude of what was happening, for their deaths marked the beginning of the greatest mystery in the history of polar exploration. There was no turning back, but now they had nowhere to rush. They had become part of the very ice they had fought so desperately against. It was the end of their journey, but the beginning of a legend, hidden beneath a thick layer of untouched Arctic snow. Years turned into decades, and White Island continued to guard its secret beneath a reliable shell of ice and snow. The world seemed to have forgotten the missing expedition, resigned to the idea that the Arctic does not return those it has taken into its embrace. Expeditions sent out in search of them returned empty-handed, capitulating to the endless expanses and harsh conditions of the drifting ice. They still hoped to weather the storm of time to find at least some traces, but the Arctic knew how to hide its trophies all too well. It was not until August 1930, 33 years after the disaster, that a chance occurrence lifted the veil of mystery. The crew of the Norwegian ship Brattvåg, which had been studying the glaciers on Bellum Island, went ashore on a beach that was usually hidden beneath a layer of ice. That year, the summer had been unusually warm, and the ice had receded, exposing rocky ground that had been hidden from human eyes for decades. The sailors walked along the shore, enjoying the rare sunshine, until one of them stumbled upon a strange object sticking out of the thawed sand. It was the moment after which everything changed, and the ghosts of 1897 finally found their voices. The object turned out to be an aluminum plate, clearly not belonging to the arsenal of modern hunters or whalers who frequently visited these waters. The Norwegians began digging up the thawed stretch of shore, and soon a sight unfolded before their eyes that took the breath away from these hardened sailors. They found the remains of a boat, tools frozen into the ice, half-decayed scraps of French silk, and most importantly, human bones. Some already understood how this would end, recognizing in these scattered items the equipment of the famous, long-lost Swedish expedition. The world went on, but for these discovered remains, time had miraculously stopped at the turn of the century. Niels Strindberg's body was found in a crevice in the rock, carefully covered with stones by his companions before their own deaths. The remains of Andrée and Frenkel lay nearby, inside a ruined hut. Their clothing had almost completely disintegrated, but some items had survived surprisingly well. Among the belongings, diaries were found, carefully wrapped in waterproof cloth, containing the final thoughts and fears of the doomed explorers. They looked at one another and saw the fear in those entries, written by the weakening hands of people freezing to death, doomed to perish. No one wanted to take on the responsibility of reading these lines aloud, feeling the weight of another's grief, frozen in time. The causes of their deaths remain the subject of lengthy, sometimes fierce scientific debates that continue to this day. The diaries ended abruptly, leaving no clear answers as to what exactly was the final straw for their exhausted bodies. Some scientists claim that they froze to death in their sleep, having exhausted all their reserves of resistance in the face of the approaching polar night. Others lean toward the theory of trichinosis poisoning from eating contaminated polar bear meat, which they were unable to cook properly. Nature made no distinction between poison and frost. It used its entire arsenal to wipe them off the face of the earth. The diaries and photographs are on display in museums, serving as a silent warning to all who take the forces of nature too lightly. Looking at these artifacts, visitors feel a chill creeping under their skin, despite the warm lighting of the museum halls. Items covered in rust and stains of decay tell the story of the slow fading of human will in the face of absolute emptiness. They still had hope when they made these entries, but the words on the paper are steeped in a premonition of death that cannot be hidden. Everything was decided here and now, on those pages where the ink froze and fingers refused to obey the mind. The story of Andrée's expedition is not a heroic epic about conquering new lands and planting flags on the world's peaks. It is a dark, terrifying chronicle of how human hubris shatters against the wall of the indifferent, monumental grandeur of northern nature. We are used to reading about survivors, about those who overcame unimaginable obstacles and returned home victorious, albeit wounded. But this story demands that we look into the eyes of those who did not return, who slowly faded away on a drifting ice floe without hope. It was the moment after which everything changed. The romance of polar expeditions gave way to the realization of just how fragile human beings are. Niels Strindberg, Salomon August, and Knut Frenkel were not cowards or fools. They were children of their optimistic, hopeful age. They sincerely believed that progress could protect them from the cold, that formulas and silk were stronger than Arctic storms and ice ridges. Their mistake lay not in cowardice, but in overestimating their own strength and underestimating an enemy they could not even properly gauge. None of them yet understood the scale of what was happening as they raised their glasses of champagne at the farewell banquet in Stockholm. But hope does not change reality, and reality was that the Arctic forgives no one's mistakes, regardless of their intentions. White Island remains as desolate and inhospitable today as it was on the day they set foot on its shores. The wind still howls between the rocks, and the ice creaks, a reminder of those who once tried to find shelter from the storm here. There are no monuments there except for a small cross erected by rescuers, which is almost always hidden under a thick layer of drifted snow. The horizon was empty, and he knew it, sensing that this place would become his grave long before his heart stopped. The world moved on, building new planes and ships, but for the three of them, history froze forever on this rocky shoal. The most terrifying thing about this story is not the fact of death itself, but the time it took for that death to come. They did not die instantly when the balloon crashed. They did not drown in the open water or get torn apart by predators in the first few days. They died over the course of months, realizing their situation every day, watching as their bodies and minds slowly broke down under the influence of their surroundings. This story reminds us that there are places on the planet where humans have never been and never will be masters. We can fly over them, we can sail past them on nuclear icebreakers, but the moment we set foot on the ice without protection, we are doomed. Nature is not cruel. It did not try to punish Andrée for his pride or Strindberg for his ambitions as a young scientist. It simply existed in its usual rhythm, where a temperature of -40 is the norm, not an extreme event. Nature made no distinctions. It digested them just as easily as it digests a fallen seal or a bird frozen in flight. When we look at a blank white sheet of paper, we can imagine that this is all that surrounds us for many miles. Imagine that there is no solid ground beneath your feet, only frozen water that could crack open at any moment and swallow you whole. Add to that a piercing cold that cannot be described in words, because it freezes even the very thoughts of warmth. He still hoped that someone was looking for him, but this sheet was too large to make out 3 small black dots on it. That was the moment after which everything changed. They became part of that sheet, dissolving into its blinding whiteness. The memory of Andrée's expedition is a scar on the body of exploration history that will never fully fade or stop hurting. It is a warning written with frostbitten fingers on pages stained with grease and blood, addressed to all of us living in comfort. It tells us that the limits of human capability exist, and that in crossing them, we must be prepared to pay the highest price. No one wanted to take responsibility for this failure, but the burden fell on the shoulders of those who remained stranded on the island. Everything was decided here and now, in this cold hell from which they never managed to find their way back to the light. Their diaries end mid-sentence, cutting off the narrative without final conclusions, without philosophical reflections or farewell prayers. There are no beautiful phrases for posterity. There is only a statement of facts regarding deteriorating health and unbearably cold weather. This makes their death all the more real, stripped of cinematic gloss, where heroes die with the right words on their frozen lips. From that moment on, he was no longer an explorer. He became a man who simply wanted to fall asleep and never wake up again. And that sleep came, covering them with the most reliable blanket this indifferent land could offer them. The ocean continues to carry its ice northwest. The wind continues to sweep snow dust from the ice ridges, erasing all traces of their presence. The Ornan balloon has long since become a myth, and its 3 passengers, shadows, forever wandering through the blizzard in search of unattainable warmth. We close the book of their lives, but we feel a cold draft emanating from these old, painstakingly developed photographs. The Arctic did not try to destroy them. It did not pursue them relentlessly, nor did it devise treacherous plans for their demise. The Arctic did not kill them quickly. It simply waited.